Hello everyone. Today we will see how to configure OSPF network step by step. So if you look at in this topology we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 routers connected each other, and we also have the 3 switches, and we have 5 different networks, and we will see how we can configure IP addresses in all of these routers, and then we will configure OSPF, open shortest path first protocol, so that we can reach from one end to the another end. So we will test how the laptop 1 can ping to laptop 2 after configuration of OSPF, and we will also see how actually OSPF um, elect the DR and the BDR, that means the designated router and the backup designated router. Let's see how we can configure one by one of the routers. So let's go open to the router 1, and we configure the IP address first to all of these routers, and then we will configure the OSPF so that the network connectivity established from one end to another end. So enable. So now we are in the enable mode of the router. Let's change the router name. So host config terminal host name R1. So we change the name of this router. Initially it was just router. Now we change it to the R1. Now we'll configure the IP address in 2 of its ports. So the interface gigabit Ethernet 01 and the gigabit Ethernet 00. So let's go to the interface mode so that we can configure the IP addresses. Okay, so interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0/1 IP address 192.168.10.1, then 255.255.255.0. So 255.255.255.0 is the subnet mask. Then no shutdown. So we configured the IP address of port or interface gigabit 01. Let's go to the interface number gigabit 00. Interface 00, then IP address 192.168.20, and the host number 1, and then again the subnet mask. Now no shutdown. Okay, so IP address configuration of router 1 is done. Now configure the IP address on router 2. Enable, then config terminal, then host name router 2, then interface we have two interface. So interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0 IP address 192.168.20 dot 255.255.255.0, then no shutdown. Then we need to configure the IP address in gigabit Ethernet 01. So let's do that. So interface gigabit Ethernet 01, then IP address is, the network is 130 network, right? So 30.1 30.1 then no shutdown, right? So the so the IP configuration on router 2 is done. So let's do the IP configuration on router 3. So CLI mode, then enable, then router 3 gigabit Ethernet 01 and 00. First configure the gigabit Ethernet 01, but before that change the name of the router. Config terminal host name router 3. Now assign the IP address to the gigabit Ethernet 01 first. So interface gigabit Ethernet 0/1, then IP address is 2 and the network is 192.168.30. So IP address 192.168.30.2 255.255.255.0, which is subnet mask. Then no shutdown. And now we need to configure IP address to the gigabit Ethernet 0/0. Interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0, then IP address 192.168.40.1 255.255.255.0, then no shutdown. So router 3 IP configuration is completed. Let's configure to the router 4. So CLI mode, then we need to rename it as a router 4. So to rename it, command is host name then name of the host. So R4 or router 4. So now let's configure the IP address in the gigabit Ethernet 01. So interface gigabit Ethernet 0/1 IP address 192.168.30.3. So the router 2 is 1, router 3 is 2, and router 4 is 3. So 3, then 255.255.255.0, then no shutdown, exit from the configure interface mode, save the configuration. So router 4 configuration for IP address configuration is completed. Now do it for router 5. Router 5 enable. So now config terminal host name router 5. Then we need to configure two interfaces. One is gigabit 0 and another one is gigabit 1 other side. So interface gigabit 0/0 IP address 192.168.40.2 255.255.255.0. So 255.255.255.0 is the subnet mask of this network. Then no shutdown. Let's configure the gigabit Ethernet 01. So interface 01, then IP address 192.168.50.1. Then no shutdown, exit from the interface mode, exit from the config mode, then save. So the IP address configuration to all the routers. So let's see what configuration we have done. If we do the show IP interface brief, so you can see what are the interfaces and what are the IP addresses we configured. So we configured 192.168.40.2 to the gigabit Ethernet 0 and 192.168.50.1 to the gigabit Ethernet 01. So the same configuration we have to the other routers. So like for example, if we look at the router 3 and do the show IP interface brief, so we can see that this router 3, that means this router we have configured the two interface gigabit 0 and gigabit 1, gigabit 0 and 1. So gigabit 0, you can see here we configured 40.1, gigabit 0 40.1, and gigabit 1 30.2. So gigabit 1, 192.168.30 and dot 2. So IP configuration is done. So now let's configure IP to the laptop. So IP configuration. So IP address 192.168.10.250, subnet mask, and default gateway is 192.168.10.1. So the default gateway is the IP address of this router's interface IP address. So we are done configuring the IP address, subnet mask, and default gateway to the laptop 1. And now let's configure IP to the laptop 2. So 192.168.50.250. Then the subnet mask is 255.255.255.0, and the default gateway is again the router is connected, this laptop connected to the router 5. So the IP address of this port is the default gateway. So IP address of this port is 192.168.50.1. So IP address of the both of this laptop configuration is done. Now let's try to ping from laptop 1 to laptop 2 and see what's happened. So command prompt, so ping 192.168.50.250. 50.250. So destination host unreachable. That means the cannot ping from one another. So network is not reachable. Okay. So the reason is because this laptop is not in the same network of the source laptop, because there are many network distance. So they cannot, the router 1 do not know what networks are this laptop belongs to. It doesn't know any information of that network. If you look at the routing table of router 1 enable, now if you do the show IP route, so you can see only the two networks. One is 192.168.20 networks and another one is 192.168.10 networks. Only the connected networks, the router 1 no. If you look at another one, let's see what the router 3 has in its routing table. So router 3 show IP route. So you can see it now only the network 30 and the network 40. So network 30 and 40 are the connected networks. Network 30 and the 40 are two connected networks of router 3. So that means by default all the routers only know the connected networks. So now to reach a packet from laptop 1 to the laptop 2, the router 1, router 2, router 3 and router 5 should know about the network 192.168.50.0 network. But router 1, router 2 and router 3 doesn't know this network. So how the router 1 and router 2 or all the routers know about all the networks? That is one way is the configuring the dynamic routing protocol. In the previous video we saw how to configure the RIP routing protocol so that every router can learn every networks. So in this video we will see how we can configure OSPF in all of the routers. How we can configure OSPF. So how we can configure OSPF network. Okay, let's now configure OSPF from one router to another router. I mean router by router. So to configure the OSPF in router 1, so now this is the router 1, so let's configure the router 1. So let's see what configuration we have. Show running configuration. So we can see we configured gigabit Ethernet 00 interface and gigabit Ethernet 01 interface with IP address 20 and the 10 networks, and we do not have any OSPF configuration, right? So now let's configure OSPF. So to configure OSPF, first we need to go to the config mode, terminal. Then we have to write the OSPF, that means the router OSPF, then the process number. So I give here the process number 1. So router OSPF 1. Then we need to add the networks that are connected to this router. So this router has the two network connected. One is 10, another one is 20. So now we need to add these two networks. So the command to add this network is network, then network address 192.168.10.0. Then we have to give the wildcard mask. So because it is a 24 network, so wildcard mask is 0.0.0.255. So wildcard mask. Then we have to tell about the area, area and 0. So area 0 means the 0 area, that means the backbone area. And in this video, in this tutorial, we will configure single area, that means all the networks, all the routers in the area number 0 or the backbone area. Okay, in OSPF you can configure multiple area, but today we will see how we configure OSPF with a single area. So we need to configure another networks, which is 192.168.20, right? So one is 10, another one is 20. So the two networks we added here. Exit. So you can check your configuration. Show running config. So now you can see you have configured OSPF in your router 1. So and added two network in the OSPF in the 0 area, that means backbone area, and process number is 1. Okay, so now let's configure the router 2. Router 2. Router 2. So again config mode, config terminal, then router OSPF, then the process number 1, then network. So we have to add two networks. One is 30 network, another one is 20 network, because we are configuring router 2. So router 2 is connected these two networks. So 192 168.20.0. Then we have to give wildcard mask 0.0.0.255 because it is a network of 24 networks. So first 24 is 000, then the last 8 byte is 255. Then the area is 0. So one network, and we have to add another network, which is 30 network. Another network is confirmed. Then so now let's see, does anything populated the routing table of router 1. If not, then we will see again the later. So router 1, show IP route. So now you can see this router, the router 1, previously there was only 10 networks and the 20 networks in the routing table. Now it has the 192.168.30 network because the router 2 now advertises this new network 30 network to the router 1, and router 1 updated its routing table with the entry 192.168.30 networks, and which is coming from OSPF. O means OSPF. So this network from OSPF. So now when we configure other routers, you can see the router 1's routing table is populating. That means you can see more networks in the routing table. So let's configure OSPF on the router 3 now. Router 3. So config terminal, then router OSPF process number 1, then network. So router 3 has network 40 and network 30. So network 192.168.30.0, then wildcard mask is 0.0.0.255, then area is 0. Then we need to add another network, which is the 40 network, right? So now we add the 40 network. Add the 40 network, 40 255. So let's see what we have configured. Show running config. So we have configured OSPF here, and 192.168.30 and 192.168.40. So the two networks we have configured in this router. Now let's configure the router 4. Router 4. So so this router, we have only one network, one interface is connected, gigabit 01, and network is 192.168.30. So now config terminal, router OSPF process number 1, then network 192.168.30 30.0, right? This is the only network. 192.168.30 is connected to router number 4. So now we need to give the wildcard mask 0.0.0.255, which is wildcard mask. Then area is 0. Now exit. Now we can see show running configuration. So we have configured OSPF with this network, 30 networks. So router 4 is configuration is done. Now let's configure the last router, which is router number 5. Router number 5. Enable. Then let's see what we have configured. Show run. So we didn't configure any OSPF here. We just configured the two interfaces with 40.2 and 50.1 IP addresses. So now config terminal, then router OSPF process number 1. So this router, and this router has two network, one is 40, one is 50. So network 192.168.40.0 192.168.40.0, then wildcard mask 0.0.0.255. Then area is 0. So because all the routers we configured area 0, that means single area OSPF. And then we also need to configure another network, which is 50 network. So 192 area 0. So we have configured the two networks, 192.168 and 68.40, and another one is 50. Exit. Then the show running configuration. So we have done configuration of these two networks, and right now let's see what we have in the router 1's routing table now. So previously, initially it was two networks, then we saw when we configuration done in the router 2, we saw 3 networks in its routing table. Now let's see how many networks it have in its routing table. Now you can see it's added, that time it was only 30, and now two more networks added, one is 40 and another one is 50. So all the 5 networks, you can see that 10 networks, 20 networks, 30 networks, 40 networks and 50 networks, and these 3 networks came through the OSPF. So this router 1 now know about all the networks in this network topology. So let's see what actually router 4 has in its routing table. Then we can see, we know show IP route. So now you can see this router also has 10 networks through the OSPF, 20 networks through the OSPF, only 30 networks was the connected networks, and 40 and 50 networks, both of the networks it got from the OSPF advertisement. So the OSPF configuration is done from one in all of these routers. Now let's see, we can ping from computer or laptop 1 to laptop 2. So now it can ping from. Now that means the network is now reachable. So your network configuration now established. So connectivity between laptop 1 to laptop 2 is established. So your OSPF configuration is done. So you can ping from any laptop connected in the network 10 to any laptop connected to the network 50 or any other network in this topology. Okay, so now let's see one more interesting thing in OSPF. It called it when the more than one routers is connected in the same networks. In that case, one of the router is elect as a DR, that means designated router, and one of the router elect as a BDR. So router 2, let's see what happened in the router 2. Router 2 enable show IP OSPF interface ID. So let's see gigabit Ethernet 0/1. Let's see what it shows us. So by this command, so you can see it's saying that designated router is 192.168.30.1 and backup designated router 192.168.40.1. So 192.168.40.1. So let's see in router 4, then it will be more clear. Router 4, let's see what actually showing in interface 01. Show IP OSPF interface, then interface ID is gigabit Ethernet 01, gigabit Ethernet 0/0/1. So you can see here the designated router is 192.168.30.1 designated router 192.168.30.1 for this one, and the backup designated router 40.1. So this one, so this router, so this one, this port or this router is not the designated router or backup designated router. Okay, so in this video we went through how to configure the IP address in all of these routers, how to configure IP address and the default gateway to the laptop, and then we configured the OSPF to all of the routers. Then we also check the routing table, so how the routing table populate when we configure the OSPF one router to another routers. And finally we see each of the routers routing table is populated with all of these networks, and then we tested again. Then laptop 1 can reach to the laptop 2 by using the ping command, and that was successful. So thank you very much, and if you want to see how to configure the RIP, you can check the previous video on RIP and also another video on static route configurations. Thank you very much.